Prolog deep in the heart of the Blackwood Forest, shrouded in mist and surrounded by ancient gnarled trees, stood Blackwood Manor. The locals whispered about it in hushed tones, calling it cursed. They said the house was alive, that it fed on the fears of those who dared enter. No one had lived there for decades, but the stories persisted. Some claimed to hear screams echoing from the forest at night. Others swore they saw shadows moving in the windows, even though the house was abandoned. But one day, a young couple, Emma and Daniel, decided to ignore the warnings. They were writers searching for inspiration for their next novel. The eerie isolation of Blackwood Manor seemed perfect. They moved in, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Chapter 1. The first night in the manor was unnervingly quiet. The air was thick, and the silence felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Emma and Daniel explored the rooms, their footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floors. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow them wherever they went. As they settled into the master bedroom, Emma noticed something strange. The fireplace, which had been cold and empty, suddenly roared to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Daniel dismissed it as a draft, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. That night, Emma woke up to the sound of whispers. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed. It was tall, its form shifting and indistinct. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned closer, and she felt a cold breath on her face before it vanished. Chapter 2. The diary. The next morning, Emma found an old diary in the library. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, the last known resident of the manor. The entries were filled with despair and fear. Eleanor wrote about strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, whispers in the halls, and a shadowy figure that haunted her dreams. The final entry was chilling. It's here, it's inside me. I can't fight it anymore. God help me. Emma showed the diary to Daniel, but he brushed it off as the ramblings of a disturbed woman. Emma, however, couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's words were warning. Chapter 3. The shadows grow. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own. The portrait seemed to change expressions when no one was looking. Emma began to hear her name being whispered, even when Daniel wasn't around. She started seeing the shadowy figure more frequently, always just out of the corner of her eye. One night, Emma woke up to find Daniel standing in the corner of the room. Staring at the wall, she called his name, but he didn't respond. When she touched his shoulder, he turned to her with empty black eyes and whispered, "It's coming." The next morning, Daniel had no memory of the incident. Chapter 4. The truth unveiled. Desperate for answers, Emma reached out to a local historian, Mr. Grayson. He reluctantly agreed to meet her and revealed the dark history of Blackwood Manor. The house had been built by a wealthy family in the 1800s, but tragedy struck when the youngest daughter, Eleanor, became possessed by a malevolent spirit. The family tried to access her identity, but it only grew stronger, eventually driving them all to madness. The spirit feeds on fear, Mr. Grayson warned. It latches onto its victims, driving them to despair until it consumes them completely. Emma realized that the shadowy figure she had been seeing was the same entity that had tormented Eleanor, and now it had set its sights on her and Daniel. Chapter 5. The ritual. Determined to fight back, Emma researched ancient rituals to banish evil spirits. She found a ritual in an old book that required a lock of hair from the possessed, a silver dagger, and a circle of salt. She convinced Daniel to help her, though he was skeptical. That night they performed the ritual in the library. As Emma chanted the incantation, the room grew colder and the shadow seemed to come alive. The figure appeared, its form more solid than before. It lunged at them, but Emma held up the dagger, reciting the final words of the ritual. The figure let out an ear-piercing scream and dissolved into smoke. For a moment, everything was still. Chapter 6. The aftermath. The next morning, the house felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Emma and Daniel thought they had succeeded, but as they packed their belongings to leave, Emma found the diary again. The final entry had changed. "You think you've won, but I'm still here and I'll never let you go." Emma's blood ran cold. She turned to Daniel, but his eyes were black again. He smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin, and whispered, "It's not over." Emma fled the manor, leaving Daniel behind. She never returned, but the shadow followed her. No matter where she went, she could feel its presence. Lurking just out of sight, she spent the rest of her life searching for a way to destroy the entity, but it was always one step ahead. Blackwood Manor still stands, waiting for its next victims, and if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might hear the whispers calling you to come closer, but beware once the shadows take hold, there's no escape. Chapter 7. The haunting follows Emma moved to a small apartment in the city, hoping to escape the shadow that had followed her from Blackwood Manor, but the entity was relentless. At night, she would hear faint whispers, and the temperature in her room would drop suddenly. She began to see the shadowy figure again, standing in the corners of her apartment, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Desperate, Emma sought help from a paranormal investigator named Victor Kane. Victor was known for his work with malevolent spirits, and he agreed to meet with her. After hearing her story, he grew serious. This entity isn't just attached to the house, Victor said. It's attached to you. It's feeding on your fear, and if we don't stop it, it will consume you completely. Chapter 8. The return to Blackwood. Victor insisted that the only way to break the entity's hold was to confront it at its source, Blackwood Manor. Reluctantly, Emma agreed. They drove to the manor, the forest growing darker and more oppressive as they approached. The house loomed ahead, its windows like empty eyes watching them. Inside, the air was heavy, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if the house itself was alive. Victor set up his equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and a strange device he called an EMP detector. He explained that the entity would likely grow more aggressive as they tried to banish it. Chapter 9. The entity's power. As night fell, the activity in the house intensified. Doors slammed shut, and the whispers grew louder, forming words, "You shouldn't have come back." The shadowy figure appeared more frequently, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Victor tried to communicate with it, but the entity only responded with rage. At one point, Emma felt a cold hand grip her wrist. She screamed, and Victor rushed to her side. Holding up a crucifix, the entity recoiled, hissing, but it didn't retreat far. It lingered in the shadows, watching. Chapter 10. The ritual. Victor explained that they needed to perform a more powerful ritual to banish the entity. This time, they would need to bind it to an object and destroy it. He pulled out a small ornate box made of iron and etched with ancient symbols. "This is a spirit trap," he said. "If we can lure the entity inside, we can seal it away." They prepared the ritual in the library, the same room where Emma had tried to banish the entity before. Victor drew a large circle of salt on the floor and placed the box in the center. He began chanting in Latin, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. The entity appeared almost immediately, its form more solid than ever. It lunged at them. But Victor held up the crucifix and continued chanting. Emma stood her ground, holding a vial of holy water. Chapter 11. The final confrontation. The entity screamed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It lashed out, knocking over furniture and sending books flying from the shelves. Victor's voice grew louder, and he gestured for Emma to open the box. As she did, the entity turned its attention to her. Its hollow eyes bored into hers, and she felt a wave of despair wash over her. But she refused to give in. She poured the holy water into the box and shouted, "You don't belong here." The entity let out a final, ear-splitting shriek and was put into the box. Victor slammed the lid shut and locked it with a silver key. The room fell silent. Chapter 12. The aftermath. Victor and Emma left the manor as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The house seemed quieter, almost peaceful. Victor warned Emma that the entity was not destroyed, only contained. The box needed to be buried in sacred ground to ensure it could never escape. They drove to a nearby church where the priest agreed to help. The box was buried in the churchyard, and a blessing was performed over the grave. Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but she knew she would never forget what she had experienced. Chapter 13. A new beginning. Emma returned to her life, but she was forever changed. She wrote a book about her experiences, hoping to warn others about the dangers of Blackwood Manor. The book became a bestseller, but Emma refused to return to the manor, even for publicity. Victor continued his work, hunting down other malevolent spirits. He and Emma stayed in touch, bonded by their shared ordeal. Years later, Emma received a letter. It was from a young couple who had bought Blackwood Manor. They wrote about strange occurrences, whispers in the halls, shadows moving in the corners, and a feeling of being watched. They asked for her help. Emma burned the letter. Her hands trembling, she knew the entity was still out there, waiting for its next victim, and she knew that some doors, once open, could never be closed. Chapter 14. The call. Emma tried to forget about the letter, but the nightmares returned. She dreamed of the manor, of the shadowy figure, and of the box buried in the churchyard. In her dreams, the box would crack open, and the entity would escape, its hollow eyes burning with rage. One night, she woke up to the sound of her phone ringing. It was Victor. "Emma," he said, his voice tense. "We have a problem. The box is gone." Chapter 15. The search. Emma and Victor met at the churchyard. The grave where the box had been buried was empty, the earth disturbed as if something had clawed its way out. The priest was baffled. He had no explanation for how the box could have disappeared. Victor's face was grim. "The entity is free, and it's stronger now. It's been feeding on the fear of everyone who's come near the manor." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "What do we do?" "We go back to the manor," Victor said. "We end this once and for all." Chapter 16. The return. The drive to Blackwood Manor was tense. The forest seemed darker than ever, the trees leaning in as if trying to block their path. When they arrived, the house looked different. Its windows were black, and the air round it seemed to shimmer faintly, like a heat haze. Inside, the atmosphere was oppressive. The walls seemed to pulse, and the whispers were louder, more insistent. The shadowy figure appeared almost immediately, its form more solid and menacing than before. "You shouldn't have come back," it hissed, its voice echoing in Emma's mind. Chapter 17. The final ritual. Victor had brought new tools for the ritual: a silver dagger, a vial of holy oil, and a book of ancient incantations. He explained that this time, they would need to destroy the entity completely, not just contain it. They set up the ritual in the library again, drawing a larger circle of salt and placing the dagger in the center. Victor began chanting, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. The entity appeared, its form shifting and writhing. It lunged at them, but Victor held up the crucifix and continued chanting. Emma stood her ground, holding the vial of holy oil. Chapter 18. The sacrifice. As the ritual reached its climax, the entity let out a deafening roar. It lashed out, knocking Victor to the ground. The crucifix fell from his hand, and the entity turned its attention to Emma. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, but she refused to give in. She poured the holy oil onto the dagger and plunged it into the entity's chest. The entity screamed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Its form began to dissolve, the shadows writhing and twisting as it was consumed by the holy oil. Chapter 19. The aftermath. When the entity was gone, the room fell silent. Victor was badly injured, but alive. Emma helped him to his feet, and they left the manor as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The house seemed quieter, almost peaceful. Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but she knew she would never forget what she had experienced. Chapter 20. A new beginning. Emma returned to her life, but she was forever changed. She wrote a book about her experiences, hoping to warn others about the dangers of Blackwood Manor. The book became a bestseller, but Emma refused to return to the manor, even for publicity. Victor continued his work, hunting down other malevolent spirits. He and Emma stayed in touch, bonded by their shared ordeal. Years later, Emma received a letter. It was from a young couple who had bought Blackwood Manor. They wrote about strange occurrences, whispers in the halls, shadows moving in the corners, and a feeling of being watched. They asked for her help. Emma burned the letter, her hands trembling. She knew the entity was still out there, waiting for its next victim, and she knew that some doors, once open, could never be closed. Chapter 21. The unseen threat. Despite burning the letter, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still out there. She began to notice strange things happening in her daily life. Her reflection in the mirror would sometimes flicker, showing a shadowy figure standing behind her. She would hear faint whispers in empty rooms, and the temperature in her apartment would drop without warning. Victor caught her one evening, his voice tense. "Emma, I've been doing some research." The entity we faced, it wasn't just a spirit. It was something older, something far more dangerous. It's not bound to the manor, it's bound to you. Emma's heart sank. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying it's not over," Victor replied. "The ritual we performed weakened it, but it's still connected to you, and it's growing stronger." Chapter 22. The cult of Blackwood. Victor's research led them to an old, forgotten cult that had once worshipped in the Blackwood forest. The cult believed in summoning ancient entities to gain power, and they had performed rituals in the manor centuries ago. The entity Emma and Victor had faced was one of these ancient beings, summoned by the cult but never fully controlled. The cult is gone, Victor said, but their rituals left a mark. The entity is tied to the land and to anyone who disturbs it. That's why it's after you. Emma felt a chill. How do we stop it for good? Victor hesitated. There's a ritual, a dangerous one. It requires a sacrifice. Chapter 23. The final plan. The ritual Victor described was ancient and forbidden. It required binding the entity to a physical object and then destroying that object in a sacred fire. But there was a catch. The person performing the ritual would have to offer a piece of themselves, a lock of hair, a drop of blood, or even a memory. Emma agreed without hesitation. She couldn't live with the entity haunting her any longer. They returned to Blackwood Manor one last time. The house seemed to sense their presence, the air growing colder and heavier as they approached. The whispers started almost immediately, growing louder as they entered. Chapter 24. The binding. Victor set up the ritual in the library, drawing intricate symbols on the floor with chalk and placing a small ornate box in the center. He explained that the box would act as a vessel for the entity, trapping it long enough for them to destroy it. Emma sat in the center of the circle, holding a silver dagger. Victor began chanting, his voice low and steady. The room grew darker, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them. The entity appeared, its form more solid and menacing than ever. It lunged at Emma, but Victor's chanting grew louder, holding it at bay. "Now, Emma!" Victor shouted. Emma pricked her finger with the dagger, letting a drop of blood fall into the box. The entity let out a deafening scream as it was pulled into the vessel. Victor slammed the lid shut and locked it with the silver key. Chapter 25. The sacrificial fire. They carried the box to a clearing in the forest, where Victor had prepared a fire pit. He lit the fire, and Emma placed the box in the flames. The entity screamed from within, its voice echoing through the trees. As the box burned, Emma felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something was being torn from her. She collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest. Victor knelt beside her, his face pale. "It's working," he said. "The entity is being destroyed, but it's taken a part of you with it." The fire burned brighter, the flames turning an unnatural shade of blue. The entity's screams grew louder, then suddenly stopped. The fire died down, leaving only ashes. Chapter 26. The aftermath. Emma felt different, as if a part of her had been lost forever. She couldn't remember certain things, her childhood pet, her favorite song, even the face of her first love. The entity had taken those memories as its prize. Victor helped her to her feet. "It's over," he said. "The entity is gone." Emma nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. Epilogue. Emma returned to her life, but she was forever changed. She wrote a second book about her experiences, warning others about the dangers of Blackwood Manor and the ancient entities that lurked in the shadows. The book became a bestseller, but Emma refused to return to the manor, even for publicity. Victor continued his work, hunting down other malevolent spirits. He and Emma stayed in touch, bonded by their shared ordeal. Years later, Emma received another letter. It was from a young couple who had bought Blackwood Manor. They wrote about strange occurrences, whispers in the halls, shadows moving in the corners, and a feeling of being watched. They asked for her help. Emma burned the letter, her hands trembling. She knew the entity was gone, but she also knew that the shadows of Blackwood Manor would always linger, waiting for their next victim.